Hi, sixth graders. Welcome to week three. Hopefully, you're all doing well. We're going to learn about ancient China this week and their innovations. So, ancient China, China's isolation. Chinese civilization developed without much influence from outside cultures. China had a combination of abundant natural resources and a fast growing population. This helped boost creative growth and innovation over a short period of time. Europeans, drawn by the rich trade goods they had seen from China, arrived at Chinese ports in the 1400s and found a very developed society. So, what this paragraph is telling us is that Chinese developed mainly on its own. It did not draw from or take from other cultures or other places. It kind of had their own ideas and it had a bunch of resources that were already in China, and the population or the amount of people there grew really quickly. So they were able to establish themselves into a well running society or group of people pretty quickly. Early in history, China had connections with Japan, Korea, and India. These were the first countries to acquire new technologies from China and, through different trade networks, spread them throughout Asia and India. Outside of these regional interactions, however, many of China's early emperors had little desire to travel beyond China and thought little of the goods coming from the foreign lands. Okay, so the Chinese, they did work with the Japanese, the Korean, and the Indians. They were the first countries to get some of the technologies that China had developed through the trade networks. Okay, but aside from those, China's emperors or the rulers didn't really want to work with other cultures or foreign lands. So China didn't really want the goods coming from them and didn't really care about sending theirs out to other people. Early European explorers, such as Marco Polo, was amazed by Chinese technology. They returned to Europe and formed their countrymen of this great civilization in the East. Interestingly, even though the Chinese were clearly a technologically advanced people, the Europeans still considered them to be barbarians. Despite Europeans' feelings of superiority, they recognized that China produced highly desirable goods and sought trade with China. They desired China's brilliant inventions and hoped to borrow from its technology. For their part, the Chinese felt that the European goods were inferior and not as good as their own. The Chinese demanded to be paid for their goods with silver or gold. Because of this trade, a lot of gold from the New World ended in China. Okay, so the Chinese technology was their thing. Um, they were advanced in that way, but the Europeans still thought that they were barbarians, or the way that they lived was not as good. Barbarians are kind of like cavemen, but the Europeans st- the Europeans felt like they were better than the Chinese, but the Chinese did have better products. Okay, the Chinese also felt like the European goods were inferior, so not as good as their own. Okay, so the Chinese felt that the European goods were inferior or not as good as their own. And the Chinese were smart, though. They demanded to be paid with gold or silver. So, because of this trade and because the Chinese demanded the good or silver, a lot of gold from the New World, it actually ended up in China. So, that was smart of Chinese. Creativity and innovation. Chinese inventions were not things that only exist in history books. Many early Chinese inventions are still important today. One of the oldest Chinese inventions is paper. Can you imagine a day without paper? Paper remains have been found in China dating back to the time of Emperor Wu, who reigned between 141 and 87 BCE. Credit for inventing paper often goes to Kai Lun in the year 105 CE, but the material has probably been around for much longer. The modern process for making paper is not too different from its beginnings. The fibers of the hemp plant were soaked in water and beaten. These fibers were then thinly strained out into a woven cloth and dried to form a single sheet. Later, other fibers from wood, bamboo, and seaweed replaced the hemp. The invention spread to Korea and Japan and eventually along the Silk Road to the west. China is also the first country known to use paper for toilet purposes. This use of paper began in the mid-1500s. Arab traders were astounded to see something other than water used in this way, and the idea spread quite quickly. Okay, so what they just said is that the Chinese was the first country to use paper for toilet paper. So they basically invented the toilet paper in the 1500s. And today we couldn't imagine not using toilet paper. Paper was also used for another innovation, a movable type. Movable type made printed material more accessible and helped spread literacy. Woodblock printing had been used to create books in China since around 800 CE. The carved blocks could be used multiple times. So we've talked about printing before. So this is just talking about literacy, which is reading. So movable type, which is just a type of printed material. They were little carved blocks that you kind of pressed into the ink, and you could make the letters out or the symbols. Another Chinese invention caused quite an explosion of interest: gunpowder. This invention came from the discovery that saltpeter, a natural mineral, explodes if used in a certain way. The Chinese originally used it to create a potion for a longer life. Their experiments led to terrible burns, and they soon realized that they could put salt pepper to a better use. As early as the 800 CE, the Chinese mixed salt pepper with sulfur and stuffed it into bamboo pieces. These early firecrackers were used to celebrate major holidays such as New Year's Day. Gunpowder as a weapon was developed later. The first recipe for military gunpowder comes from a Chinese military manual in 1044 CE. Gunpowder technology spread along the Silk Road to the Middle East. Once there, the people in the Middle East developed better cannons and explosives. The Europeans did not begin using gunpowder until the mid 1300s. Okay, so we know the Chinese invented paper, which we use. They also were the first people to use it as toilet paper. Exciting and thankful for that. And then they also found gunpowder. So they used a natural mineral that they had, one of their resources that was already in their land, called salt pepper, and they created gunpowder with it. So at first they used it to make explosives, like for New Year's Day, like for firecrackers. They didn't use gunpowder for guns, like as a weapon, until the 1400s. Innovations led to luxury. The Chinese developed hundreds of other innovations, including the compass and the spoon. Some Chinese innovations help people enjoy lives of luxury. One of the most sought after Chinese innovations was porcelain. This is a fine type of pottery that can only be made by using extremely high heat. Early forms of porcelain were invented during the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE. The Europeans did not figure out how to produce it until 1709. So the Chinese, they were really early in things that they did. The Europeans were quite a bit behind them. So the next thing that we talked about right here is the compass. A compass is used for directions north, east, south, and west, and northeast, southeast, west, whatever, to help you find your way when you're traveling. We don't use compasses much today because we have maps on our phones, so that helps us. But a compass was really important to help people figure out where they were going. They also made porcelain. Porcelain makes many things like dishes and pottery. A lot of things you find in your house that are for decoration may have been made of porcelain. So another impressive ancient Chinese invention was silk. This material is mainly used for fancy clothing. Interestingly, it comes from a caterpillar. Around 1300 BCE, the Chinese figured out how to raise silkworms. Soak the cocoons in hot and cold water and extract the silk. The silk threads were then dyed and woven together into a luxurious cloth. This process is still used today. Okay, so I didn't actually know that. I didn't know that the silk came from silkworms and that you soak the cocoons, the part that the caterpillars are in hot and then cold water and then pull the silk out. That's pretty cool. So silk, as we talked about last week, was really, really important for the Chinese. So now we have paper, we have gunpowder, we have silk, we have porcelain. So the Chinese, they're really doing a good job getting stuff, inventing things. Silk allowed people in China to dress in fine, beautiful clothing, but it did more than that. Silk allowed China to become very important in terms of world trade. The Chinese exported silk cloth to the West for many centuries. It was not until monks returned to Europe from China in 550 CE with silkworm eggs that Europeans learned the secret to producing silk. you remember last week we talked about that the Chinese did not want to tell anybody how to make silk. They had a monopoly on the silk market, which means they were the only ones. So they made beautiful clothing and they traded it, and that's how they got a lot of their money. Although Europeans knew about silk and other Chinese goods, it was not until the 1400s that the world really started to learn about China. In 1405, the Chinese admiral Zheng went on an expedition to show China's wealth and power to the world. This expedition is what eventually brought European explorers and traders to China. After that period, China was content to exist in solitude and only allowed limited access to its cultures and goods. The inventions mentioned here, including the use of silk, movable type, paper, are only a handful of innovations from China that changed the world. Chinese technology was very advanced and paved the way for many modern inventions. In fact, Chinese inventions helped spur the European exploration of the world. Europe's demand for Chinese goods changed European society. Even today, Chinese innovations have an impact on people living all around the world. Okay, so it's real important when we think about this because a lot of the questions at the end of this unit are going to talk about the innovations that China brought. Okay, so you might want to refer back to here and talk about the movable type, the paper, the silk, the gunpowder, and how those things were important. If you have any questions, let me know.